Before this unit started, we asked you to participate in an exercise to demonstrate the differences between one-way and two-way patterns of communication. Chances are you probably found that in the one-way pattern of communication, the typical management approach to communicating, you probably thought that it was rather fast. I bet it was pretty quiet in that room, and I also bet that it was not very accurate. Now, bosses like one-way patterns of communication because it allows them to hide behind their desk to send out directives and to reduce their own cognitive dissonance when the work doesn't get done. They can always leap out and say, "You didn't do what I told you to do." Keep in mind, you can go out and repeat the same exercise again. You can say, "All right, I'll tell you again." You can come in early, you can stay late, repeat it again and again, and they still may not be able to accomplish what you want them to accomplish. But at least, of course, you can say, "I came in early, I worked hard, too bad I've got such a lousy group." Now contrast that to the two-way patterns of communication. You probably saw in that microcosm, in that room, that two-way communication is slow. It's noisy. It doesn't appear to be very efficient. But I'll also be willing to bet it's a lot more accurate. You see, two-way patterns of communication are really employee-centered, not boss-centered. Employees feel better about the process, not their managers. Another problem with two-way patterns of communication is that the boss is placed under psychological attack. You often get more information back than you want. For the first time, any private in the Army can raise their hand and say, "Stop, General, go back to block number 1. For the first time, people may demonstrate in the room that they can draw the blocks better than the boss can, and they don't have the diagram. That not all the brains of the outfit are contained at corporate headquarters. For example, it's a little bit like being a second lieutenant. You have power, you have authority as a manager to get things done. It's like having a cannon. And you've got these targets that you really got to knock off regularly, every week, every month, every year. You've gone through this program, we've told you that when things go wrong, when you need new information, when you want to improve the way things are done, the old way of one-way communication, shut up and do what I tell you, isn't going to cut it for you. You really have to enlist the cooperation of the people who work for you. If you've learned your lessons well in this program, you'll probably stop and say, this is a time for participative management. Why? Because something has changed. There's an obstacle between me and that target that I want to accomplish. You get all the troops together, you caucus, you do a little force field analysis, a little brainstorming, you apply all the techniques of this program, and the troops decide that the best way to handle this particular situation is to put a private on top of the hill with a pair of binoculars. You'll give them a radio, you've already got a radio, you'll link yourselves together, and now you've got a closed system. Chances are you'll stop and you'll say to yourself, boy, I never would have thought of that all by myself, sitting alone in my office. I'm so glad that I used two-way patterns of communication to come up with this new system. You clear the radios, and the private will acknowledge that the radios are working, he has the target in sight. You lob over your first shell, confident now that you and your team are going to eliminate that target. The shell lands right here. You missed the target. But you see, now you know you missed because you have the system that you and your team developed. The private radios back to you, the officer, and he says, "Sir, we overshot the target by 1,500 meters. I suggest we drop range so many degrees," and so on. And you think to yourself, you know, this participative management stuff is wonderful. We overshot the target. He never cared about targets before, and I'm getting better information for decision making. You make all the necessary adjustments, you lob over your next shell, now you're confident that you and the group are really going to accomplish this objective. And the shell lands right here. You don't know why it landed there. And before you can hold another group meeting, a faint voice comes back on the radio, down the very same channel that you were getting good information for decision making. And the faint voice says, "You stupid son of a bitch, I told you 15 degrees, not 50. You almost killed me." Well, the extra information, his feelings about your family background, have nothing to do with that target. In fact, now that you know where he is, bam, you got a new enemy. That happens all the time to managers who try to practice participative management, but managers who aren't tough in the process. Remember we said all along, you've got to establish clear and structured expectations so that everybody understands what the dynamics are going to be? A friend of mine became the vice president of a major insurance company. He was a believer in participative management. He hired my firm, and we surveyed 2,500 employees who worked for him. They were all salesmen in this insurance company. The salesmen worked in 141 agencies. We surveyed the salesmen with an instrument that really asked them, how are you being managed, and what are the output variables? Given this kind of management, how does it affect your productivity, your sense of quality, and job satisfaction? We then lumped all the data into the computer, and we asked the company to identify the top 10 agencies out of the 141. We looked at the results, the surveys from the salesmen in the top 10 agencies, compared them to everybody else. Were they being managed differently? And by gosh, they were, with strong statistical significance. All the salesmen in the top 10 agencies reported that they were being managed in a participative way, group problem solving, group goal setting. My friend, the vice president, really liked that because he's a believer in these kinds of concepts. Using this program, we trained over 800 people in his organization throughout those 141 agencies to manage participatively in a two-way mode, in a two-way dialogue. Well, 9 months went by. My friend called me up and said, I have a problem with this participative management stuff. I said, what's your problem? He said, first of all, we've had an 11% increase in profitability, the highest rate of increase in the last 15 years in this company since we started this stuff. And I said, what kind of a problem is that? He said, that's not my problem. He said, my problem is people are talking back to me. For example, one of my vice presidents, he said, just called me up and said that something that I, the boss, wanted to do was just unacceptable and I shouldn't do it. Well, no one ever talked back to him before. And then he went on to say, I want you to come down to the corporate headquarters next week. I'm bringing in my 4 vice presidents. I want to nip this kind of stuff in the bud. So I went down there and I talked to 5 people who 9 months before had sat in the same room with me. And I pointed out to them that 9 months ago, we agreed that you were going to make a commitment to change the way work was done in this organization. You're going to spend some money and some time to really try to turn it around. Didn't I promise you 9 months ago that there were no promises? That I wasn't going to promise you a rose garden? That when you try to manage participatively, you often replace one set of problems with another set of problems? And then before they could answer, I said, but isn't an 11% increase in profitability the highest rate of increase in 15 years worth what you're complaining about? Thinking, of course, that they would say yes. They didn't. There was a long silence. I was reminded of Jack Benny's old line, your money or your life. And there was this long silence, and he said, I'm thinking, I'm thinking. They thought, and very reluctantly, I thought, they finally came around to the idea that, yeah, I guess it's worth it. It's not as easy to manage the way it used to be, but by gosh, the organization sure was performing, but they were now earning their money. This is not an easy way to manage, but you have to do it if you want quality, if you want effectiveness, if you want performance. Whether or not you're moving people towards organizational objectives or evaluating performance quarter by quarter, year to year, the principle's the same. You've just got to engage in meaningful two-way dialogue. We were engaged recently to explore the problems that a company was having with their performance appraisal system. Every year, every employee was evaluated with a 15-page form. The president of the company was not happy with the results that he was getting, and he wanted to explore another way of turning performance appraisal into a more dynamic process like performance management. The comptroller of the company handed me this form, 15 pages long, and he was complaining about it. He said, you see this form full of questions like how well is the employee doing against stated objectives and so on? What are the opportunities for improvement, or where did he screw up? He said, the problem with this form is that I have to fill it out on 9 people who work for me every year. Each of the 9 people who work for me have 15 people who work for them. They have to fill out the form on all of their employees, 15 pages each. And I said, well, what do you do with all that paper every year? He said, I get it all together and I bind it into a great book. I make 7 copies of the book. I lock 1 copy into my desk drawer and send 6 copies off to the personnel department. I said, what does this personnel department do with the 6 copies of the 2,000 plus pages? And he looked at me and he said, damned if I know. So often we submit to forms, we fill out information, but we really aren't providing any meaningful feedback to the people who work for us. We're really not geared to improve their performance. So often, a typical performance appraisal scenario ends up looking something like this.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Okay.
Good. Sarah, I wanted to talk to you because I'm going to tell you how I'm rating you. Now, first, For appearance, I'm giving you a 10, because you're always very nice to look at. For initiative, Sarah, I'm going to have to give you a 6.
Is there some specific reason?
Self-starting.
I thought I was picking up pretty well and all.
No, you are picking up pretty well. But,
You mean compared to the other people who are working here?
Sarah, let's just leave it at the 6. Now, in terms of adaptability, I'm giving you a 7. In terms of dependability, I'm giving you a 7 as well.
Is there a problem there?
Sarah, we really aren't here to argue. Now, working relationships.
Effective management is a lot like bowling. I bet a lot of you every weekend on Friday nights go out to bowl. And you probably got Bernie's Delicatessen stenciled across your back. And you get up there with this big heavy ball and you roll it down that alley and you knock the pins down and you record your own score. If it's my score, you record a 3. People who work for us are also bowling every day. They've got responsibilities, they've got work to do. They come in every day and they take that ball of responsibility and roll it down the alley. The only problem is there's a curtain between them and the pins. They hear thunk, they hear bing, and they often get no feedback at all. Sometimes a supervisor may yell from the other side of the curtain, 6 or 2. But most of the time, as we've just seen, an employee comes to work and rolls that ball down the alley under the curtain and hears thunk or bing, and no feedback. If they get very frustrated, they may say, "How am I doing?" And a voice from the other side of the curtain will yell back, "I'll tell you at your performance appraisal." Our job is to strip away the curtain, is to move people closer to their objectives and their responsibilities, to improve their productivity and by doing so the quality of their work. Let's spend some time now giving you a chance to practice providing effective feedback.